Hi, I'm Theo, and these broadcasts are to support the blogs on nomoreshee.com's website as well as the online classes. In this episode, part 2 in our series on sacred threads. Welcome back to the No More She broadcast, where we're continuing today our series on sacred threads in part 2. Now, Josephus describes it, says they are also inscribed in their doorways the greatest of the benefits that God had bestowed upon them, and each will display them on his arms, and as many things as are able to show forth the power of God and his goodwill toward them, let them display on the head and the arm, so that the favor of God with regard to them may be readily visible from all sides. You know, you were supposed to do that. You get up in the morning, and as light is coming forth in that liminal state between light and darkness, as you're moving out of darkness, and it's always darkest before the dawn, and you're moving into the light for your day to start your work, that you get up and you put this on and you pray. And then when you leave your house is another thing that we'll talk about, the mezuzah that also had this about it. And you would gesture toward it with a kiss. And again, as you're moving through the boundaries and the pillars, that is, I'm talking about the gates, that is the extension, the furthest extension of your authority as the head of that piece of property or parcel of ground, and move into the wider world where someone else has the authority of your own home. And you're moving out into this world, and you're moving across this continuum, this holiness spectrum, just like that's laid out in the sanctuary. This trajectory that they're moving about from east to west and west to east, as a worshiper moves from outside the temple precinct or the sanctuary into these various compartments, from the outer part where you first enter and offer the sacrifice and where the animals and the water is, and move through the pillars into the actual house, the box, the building, the confines. Again, the boundaries, you cross the boundaries and go through liminal states until you finally get to the Holy of Holies where Yahweh is present. And you cross through that. So you were supposed to then, as you leave your house, you were supposed to do this to show forth the power of God. As you have exuded and you are imaging the glory of God, as you're filling the whole earth with God's glory, as you image God and his power as a disciple of him, this power is what controls you. It is your rule of life. Remember the community rule of life in Qumran. It is what you have bound yourself to be. Who you are, it is your identity. It's what controls, that spirit of self-control that Paul talks about as a part of the fruit of the Spirit, that causes you to be who you are. And when people see you, they see Jesus. They see God in the way that you live. Justin Martyr talks about it, and they're having the dialogue with Trifle, and they're discussing, what parts, because Trifle's a Jew, and which parts of Judaism intermingle with Christianity. And it's interesting here, the quote, "Then said I again, consider that for all the hardness of your hearts, God gave you all such commandments by Moses, that you might, by these numerous ordinances in every act, have him before your eyes, and not begin to act either unjustly or impiously." You're supposed to see the world through God's eyes and act accordingly. And where there's injustice, you're not to add to it, but you're supposed to work to relieve this world of injustice. You're to make it just. You're to make it right, righteous. Hence, he commanded you to wear the scarlet ribbon, that through it you might not forget him, and to gird yourselves with a phylactery made of very small strips of parchment, and inscribed with characters which we can see to be certainly sacred, inciting you by such means ever to bear him in your minds. At the same time, he convicts you for not having preserved in your hearts the slightest remembrance of godliness, not being even thus persuaded not to fall into idolatry. That you will ascend to the heights like the eagle above the storm, will not get caught up in the clouds and in the powers that fight for control over who's going to be worshipped the most on the earth. No, no, no. You're above all that, and you're with Yahweh, knowing that he is the supreme above all. And you're not enticed to stop and focus on any of the powers and worship them and be caught up in what they want to do. You are focused on being just and pious, just as God is, participating in his kingdom through your virtuous living as you walk with God and represent him, image him in the earth, meeting every injustice with justice. Every wrong is met with the right. And then again, in the rabbinical literature, he whose deceased relative is lying before him before the burial, the body is exempt from the recitation of the Shema, from the prayer, and from the wearing phylacteries, and from all religious duties listed in Torah. So you have to be dead. And if you're involved in things that are dead, you cannot do these things. Then you're exempt from these things because you're in contact with the dead and you're not participating in the life. So you're exempt from these things. But it's mentioned here in the rabbinical literature as well that these are connected. The recitation of the Shema, from the prayer, and from the wearing of phylacteries. So they're tied together. All of this. Your prayers, the Shema, and the phylacteries are all tied together. And so inside that box is those scriptures. And we'll get into that. Now, we mentioned earlier the mezuzah. Also, it has parchment inside. And notice it's just got the 3 here, where the other one had 4. And so it doesn't have everything. But this is what you are to kiss your hand and touch as you leave your house. This is, again, and then when you return home, again, you are supposed to kiss it. And it's reflexive of that as you leave and as you go, that you're going to go and you're going to carry forth out of your house, just like the priests carry out of God's house, God's presence into this world, just like Adam and Eve were supposed to carry out of Eden into the rest of the world and fill the whole earth with God's glory. So it's known as the mezuzah, and that's a part of this that we've been talking about, where in Deuteronomy 6:9, you shall write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates, on the boundaries of your authority, at the fringe, at the border of your property, before you go out into another's property. But as you go out, you're going to carry and represent as an ambassador the rule by which rules your life in the ruler, as you seek to have him and his reign rule over you. And so that rule guides you in every step you make as you walk with God, and you walk in these same steps in your house. And that should be the authority by which everyone in your house, that is, includes your spouse, includes siblings or parents or children or servants, all of that, even the animals, they're all going to be affected by that which is under your rule. But as you depart and you move out, again, it's marking the boundaries, the liminal state of your authority, personal authority, and you go into the rest of the world. You're going to live by this, and you're not going to let them rule over you. You're going to allow Yahweh to ever be your ruler. And 11:20, you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on the gates. So that's what is marking out your space as sacred space. Because this is what you have set up as the priest of your home have set up, that you're bounded by this. And at the outermost fringes, and just like any king wants to expand his territory, you want to expand the kingdom of God so that the whole earth becomes full of God's glory. Now again, we keep talking about the Shema, interestingly enough. So it's Deuteronomy 6:4-9, and it's the, hallmark of Judaism, and it's what's contained in these boxes that we've been talking about. And it's from here. And it's the word here. Shema, hear. O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. That's, Shema. And those who hear God, hear and obey. It's incorporated. Both in that word is incorporated that those who hear, we know they heard. Why? Because they do it. And whether they leave their property, they still do it. Okay? So no matter where you go, they're walking. To love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. And these words that I command you today shall be in your heart. You shall teach them diligently. Children shall talk with them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise. Again, see all this cycle? And wherever you go. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. So this passage, along with those others, there's 4 passages that are contained in the phylactery. Now, we can't cover everything, and we're already quite long in the video. Jesus was asked about, what is the greatest commandment? And he turned to the Shema, pointing out that this is first. And then obviously second is your neighbor, because when you leave your doorpost, what's the first thing you're going to do? You're going to encounter someone else. And you need to exemplify God's justice for them and to them. So, whether they are a victim and of injustice and need justice, and you should reconcile them to God's justice, or whether they're a perpetrator upon a victim, they still need to be restored, and they still need to be made right with God, so they're no longer perpetrating. Again, back to Douglas Knight quote that we often talk about on this channel. Both the victim and the perpetrator need to be made right. Anything wrong needs to be made right. So Jesus ties that in here in the Great Commandment. So even he understood this. So back to where we began, Matthew 23:5. They do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make phylacteries and broad and their fringes long. Now we'll return to phylacteries, but I want to now look at the second word, the fringes, momentarily, because we're talking about sacred threads. These are things that people wear and that they weave about their bodies, and that are part of what's going on here. So this is tied into this. And it's the very edge, the border of the garment. And of course, we're going to see that in many places. But where does it come from originally? Well, in Numbers chapter 15, verses 37 to 41, the Lord tells Moses, speak to the people of Israel and tell them to make tassels on the corners of their garments, on the borders, tassels, throughout their generations, and to put a cord of blue. Interesting, blue. And this blue represents what? Well, blue is a part of the sanctuary. It's a part of the coloring system inside the sanctuary. But it's also, it's blue. When you think of blue, when you look out in this world, what do you see? There are 2 things that are blue. The waters that reflect the skies. So heaven and earth becoming one. And water represents life. And life comes from above, and the water of the rain and the waters that come down from the mountain and the tributaries. Psalm 104. So the water cycle that's mentioned in Job, the latter chapters of Job. And so this blue represents heaven. It's God's life. Maybe even if you look at your veins in your body, the blood is red, but when you see them, they're blue from your perspective. It's life. So the coloring system. So this blue represents royalty. Okay, so there's a lot that could be done with that. The tassel, on the tassel of each corner, it shall be a tassel for you to look at and remember all the commandments of the Lord, to do them, not to follow after your own heart. That's key. James says, you are the greatest deceiver by deceiving yourself. And he describes that in chapter 1, how you can fall away and follow after your own desires. So this is directly what James is addressing in chapter 1. And your own eyes, which you have inclined to whore after. Your own eyes. That's why you put this, you want to see things from God's perspective. So you shall remember to do all my commandments and be holy to your God. Be holy as I am holy. Participate in that holiness. We can be holy in the sense that God is holy, in a sense. We never become again participate enough to become Trinity itself. We don't join that club. But we participate in as much as we can without becoming Trinity. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. Why did he bring them out of Egypt? To be their God. I am the Lord your God. So this is what it's tied to. So this is a part of their uniform, a part of their identity, their garments that they wear. Deuteronomy 22:12, you shall make for yourselves tassels on the four corners of your garment, which you cover yourself. See, Adam and Eve became naked when they lost the glory of God, were no longer clothed in light. And so now this is a way that the light of the sun that goes through and what colors the sky is blue. So as the light shines upon us, we're reflecting again, imaging, mirrors of heaven on earth. That's all built into this. Now this tassels again. Interesting is gadilim. And I keep talking. I did extensive research into this, but didn't all make it in my dissertation because there's just so much you can do in a dissertation, and I was limited on so many ways. But you're participating, again, in the heavenlies. And so it's constantly showing how the human body is reflecting heaven and earth, just as the sanctuary is reflecting heaven and earth. So you have the blue in the sanctuary, you have the blue in the priest's garments, you have the blue here in the person's garment. And so in the tabernacle, what do you have? There were lattices of checker work with wreaths of chain work for the capitals on tops of the pillars, and lattice for the one capital and lattice for the other. These pillars that are in the sanctuary, in the temple in this case, okay? It's the wreaths of chain work. This wreath of chain work is the same word, gadilim. So it's woven into the fabric of the sanctuary in a sense, but it's woven into the fabric of the very clothes that we wear, that we're carrying God's presence out of the temple, out of our homes, into this world, that we're walking with God as we walk along with God as we are living Torah. As I talk about again in my first series, one of my earliest series on this channel on prophecy and promise, we're living examples of the Torah. Following that mandate that is the rule of law for our life. That mandate, human mandate, that defines us from creation of what it means to be human. That's exemplified fully in Christ. That he is 100% what it means to be God, obviously, but he's 100% what it means to be human. And he is full participation in both, and asking us to participate as much as we can in being more human, in the sense of being more like Christ, but also that allows us participation with God. And these are known as the tzitzit. Okay, and you see that in Matthew 9:20. Behold, a woman who had suffered from a discharge of blood for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment. She touched this border, where, again, the kingdom of God, all the way from heaven, is extending that authority through Christ. And she is outside because she's impure, suffering from a blood discharge for 12 years. She's an outsider. She cannot enter into. And she is outside, an outsider, impure. And he is extending that purity. And when she touches it, she becomes pure. And his authority translates now, and now the kingdom of God is authoritative over her, and she becomes a disciple of the kingdom. And her life is made right. And as Jesus embodied John 1:14, the glory of God. And John says elsewhere in his epistle, we've seen the glory of God because we saw Jesus. She touched it and felt the glory of God, and it cleansed her. And he was on this border, the border where he's pressing the border of the kingdom into enemy territory. And she is on that liminal state, Mark 6:56, and wherever he came in, villages, cities, countryside, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and implored him that they might touch even the fringe of his garment. And as many touched it were made well. Again, they're all outsiders. The border. And he is bringing heaven on earth so the two can become one in full participation. And they are privated due to their illnesses and sicknesses that make them unclean and unfit, because only life can be in the presence. And no form of death is allowed. And so people who are not whole, and he is making them whole. So there's a lot of purity involved in this as well. Exodus 19:6 is what's behind this. And you shall be to me, this mandate, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel. So as they model the priest, the high priest, out in this world by wearing the blue tassels. Again, it's not all blue. There's just one thread that's blue. But they're modeling, bringing heaven on earth, that the one who rides upon the clouds, upon the blue space out there, the one who walks on the blue water of the waves in the storm. And then we get in the waters of baptism. And so this blue idea that represents royalty and life, the divine, heaven. Additionally, when we're talking about property, often in the ancient world and even today, the boundaries between nations or boundary markers, landmarks that in real estate are often bounded by the waters. And so to move from one point into another takes a transition through the waters, much akin to Moses' exit out of Egypt through the waters of what is commonly referred to as the Yam Suf, the Red or Reed Sea, depending on different scholars, and then Joshua's entry into the Promised Land via the Jordan, and how the Bible describes it's from river to river in their cosmological, geographical markers in the biblical narrative. I find that emphasis, interestingly, how one transitions through water, and even in the book of Leviticus, those things which are made pure, which were in an impure or unclean state, can be made so either through fire or passing through water. And obviously, one of the main ways that people overcome their impure or unclean ritual state is by washing, which is an emphasis not only in Leviticus, but as a result, the Pharisees bring up much washings in their practices and rituals because of this key factor of water. And so by touching the blue, it kind of represents this in some metaphorical sense. And so all of us, and so we are kingdom of priests and a holy, purity, ritualistic. We're participating in God's life, his everlasting life, the eternal life. 1 Samuel 24, 4-6, David cut the corner, the border of Saul's robe, and he wished he hadn't, because he said, that's not what you're supposed to do. And he felt horrified by it. But he knew that it was coming to an end, but that's not David's choice. That's the divine council's choice. Just like the day that Ahab dies, it's up to the divine council to make that decision of when that's supposed to happen and how it's supposed to happen. And he cannot usurp that in any way. He has to be patient and let it pan out according to the will of heaven and the heavenly order when they decide. Because Saul still is representative of God. And so to cut his robe, it's a sign. And even Samuel's robe is cut in a sense by Saul. So this points back to that. When Samuel's garment is torn, okay, the priest's garment is torn, and David tears and is representative that as Saul was told by Samuel, it'll be torn, this is representative of that. In Zechariah 8:22 and 23, many peoples and strong nations shall come and seek the Lord of hosts in Jerusalem, Zion, the holy place, heaven and earth, the sacred place, and entreat the favor of the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts, in those days 10 men from the nations of every tongue shall take hold of the robe of a Jew, saying, let us go with you, for we have heard that God is with you. Emmanuel, God is with you. This Emmanuel theology. You walk with God. So if I walk with you, I'm walking with God. And what do they grab? That fringe of that garment. Because they are outsiders. And how does an outsider come into your kingdom? How do they come into? They have to cross the boundaries. And how does a person come into Christianity? They have to go through the boundaries to the waters of baptism, just like in new birth. When a baby is born, the pregnant woman's water breaks. So the baby comes through water. And just like Moses crossed the Red Sea to get out of Egypt, and Joshua crossed the Jordan to get into the Promised Land. And Moses looked from the other side of Mount Pisgah, but he did not get to go into the Promised Land because he did not cross the boundaries of that water, the liminal state, the waters that bounds. In Genesis 1, the waters are bounded there. The land pushes up and pushes the waters to the outer fringes. And the outer fringes of one's kingdom, and the outer fringes of one's gates of one's property, one's house. And the pillars of the temple, by which you pass through those pillars and you enter into the precincts that are very holy. As you go from sacrificing the animals and enter through those pillars into the holy house of God, the boundaries. And so they want to enter in, so they have to go to the borders, the fringe. Again, phylactery. So comes from this Greek term, meaning to watch or to guard, which is what Adam and Eve did. Interestingly, you have the idea of the heavenly beings that are watchers. So, in some sense, the powers that are supposed to, again, Psalm 82, that are supposed to, these heavenly beings that are the guardians of the galaxy, they're supposed to be God's vessels, his heavenly representatives of his justice in the world to bring about his just rule. But they don't. They bring their own rule of injustice, and they're judged for it. And they're replaced by God's holy ones who are faithful to him, to walk in his way, in this mandate for humanity that we've talked about numerous times on this channel. The name phylactery and rabbinical attempts point to that they were used originally to ward off evil in the Hellenistic and Roman eras. There was an idea of phylacteries that would ward off, that were used to ward off evil. That as you put these things on, you're entering in, and we have these things today. We talk about how in Hollywood that certain things on holy ground cannot, certain evil cannot fight or cannot come in on holy ground. It's the same idea. When you put these on, you are in sacred space. They protect you because that those bounds cannot be breached, because death cannot happen in the presence of God in life. And so it was believed along that sense. And it appears in the great Paris magical papyrus that we have fragments of. And in fragment K that's on exorcism, in the great Paris magic papyrus, we have this idea of the phylacteries. And this is, again, a collection of magical incantations and formulas belonging to possibly one magician in ancient Egypt. Dating around the early 4th century AD, the document contains a wide variety of magical traditions from earlier sources, and this idea of phylacteries appears even here in the sectional exorcism, so it's used in that sense, in that context. The word is used. Now, Maimonides said, he who has tefillin upon his head, upon his arm, tzitzit on his garment, and mezuzah on his door, he is safe from sin, since he has many reminders of his duties. So again, there's this idea of a prophylactic of safety, that it's tied to both a ritual purity that's also tied to a moral order that prevents evil from coming upon you. So, Alan Siegel describes in an article that if a non-scriptural origin for this practice is ever found, it would not surprise me if it were related to commemoration, oath-swearing, or cursive words in the ancient Near East. So Alan Siegel, famous Jewish scholar, has noted that, again, it has these connections, okay, to these things that, again, Abraham, whoever blesses you, I will bless. And whoever curses you, I will curse. As you walk with me. And part of this is exemplified in the wearing of these things and the daily practice of entering into this presence. Just like the sun and moon make their daily cycles, we also have to make cycles in our prayer time to maintain that connection, that fellowship, that koinonia, that participation, rather than privation. Going on in other rabbinical sources, there's a connection between the phylactery and an amulet. And although there's no direct connection made here, there's no direct connection made between the phylactery and the amulet, they do seem to appear together all the time. And some of these amulets are, again, it's not said, but some of these amulets are magical and they powerful, and they used in exorcisms or used to protect one from certain powers or demons or whatever evil they ward off. So the idea of the amulet and then the phylactery is appearing alongside of it in the rabbinical literature. It makes, there's no direct connection listed, but it's just odd that they're placed together so much. And so the idea of this even the language of the term, what does it mean to wrap it around your head? And so they tying it to, okay, you tie the box, and the box is like the amulet in a sense, I guess, is what they end up coming up with. And when they're trying to figure out how to make these things, just as a woman uses the same thing to tie a jewel amulet around her head, so then must be what it is, because there's no physical description of how this was supposed to be. I showed you pictures of what they think is in view and that they have interpreted it and the practice among Jews today based upon what their readings are, but there was no idea, how does this bind you? How you tie it around your head? But it binds you to these practices, to participate in this mandate for all of humankind that we again talk about from Kaiser in this 2 Samuel chapter 7 verse 9 language of the Torah. That's a mandate for all of humanity to walk with God, to participate in Him. So go back again to my prophecy and promise, my old series on that. But that's the idea here. So the very custom of wearing these phylacteries might have emerged as a popular superstition, one which was then made noted by the leaders of the Jewish community who stripped the symbol of its original magical overtones and infused it with more legitimate religious significance. But there is some tradition that it's tied to, and that's from the Anchor Yale Bible Dictionary, Ruth Satinover, on phylacteries. So that it's tied to some prophylactic nature, and it's tying that, and then it's tying into the ritual, the liturgical nature. So the ritual then is a reality that we're trying to traffic in supernatural language, and we're trying to protect ourselves from those powers that are not good, and because of their lust and quest for things that are selfish, and they're not the good giving God that we talk about from James chapter 1. Again, go back to our James series on the last one on the giving good God, how James describes God from a truly Jewish perspective. But then the idea of reciprocity there. So, they're not all the powers are aligned with the kingdom of God for the goodness of all of humanity and for all of creation. And that's why Romans 8, all of creation groans. So you have more rabbinical stuff here where the ball, the shoe, the amulet, and the phylacteries which were torn. Interestingly, they tie these two together. A man should not go without a nail-studded sandal, a single sandal if he has no wound on his foot. Tefillin, an amulet when it is not by an expert, a breastplate, a helmet, and greaves. So you got to have, again, they're tied together, the tefillin and amulet, all across the literature for some reason. And we're going to stop there and pause, and we'll continue on with something that's a little anticlimactic in Ezekiel chapter 13, where there's something that is like the Antichrist of the tefillin, an artificial version, that's a cheap makeoff of the tefillin, and we will continue our discussion with that in the next episode. We hope you've enjoyed this brief survey in so far these parts regarding the sacred threads that bind about a person's body and binds them to one another to live for justice, but also binds themselves to heaven's rule, the rule of law, the rule of life. Again, Kaiser's mandate for all of humankind from 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 9, when David is talking about he wants to build a house for God. Again, it's tying that language of earth and earthling, of the human element to being the temple of God's Spirit, and then the actual building itself that's built, and the ritual, the liturgical senses of participation in that is reflected in the daily life and walk of a human to live out the Torah as God always intended it. So go back to our series on prophecy and promise to dig all that out, and you'll see what I'm talking about there. So I can't just keep repeating what I've already said in previous videos all the time, and I'll never get anywhere. So hopefully you've enjoyed this, but you'll see where we and sacred space and God all come together in heaven and earth are constantly being described in the Bible as becoming one in participation with one another, until we get to like the latter chapters of Isaiah and the latter chapters of Revelation, where all of this consummates in the end and they do become one. And so right now we're in that liminal state, and we're moving toward that aspect, and our lives should be growing and maturing toward such participation. But we're not there yet. So it's the not yet. We're in the now, reflecting as much as God's glory to fill the earth with his glory until we get to the not yet, when Christ comes and consummates everything in his second coming. And that's how it's described in the scriptures for us. So hopefully this has been quite interesting, and we have so much more to get into that it's unreal. We've just started. We very, very shallowly, narrowly have scratched the surface. And I wish I could go into each one of these things that I've already talked about. And I've got so much more notes and things I want to discuss. Each one of these things deserve its own series probably, and hours of study, because the way they do the tassels and tie the knots, all of that stuff is quite interesting, and how it's done. It all has significance and symbolic meaning, and it's all liturgical, and it's all ritualistic, but it also reflects realities in which we are to constantly keep our minds focused on when the chaos of this world wants us to think about something else. And we need to keep our minds focused on him to remain in that peace that Douglas Knight keeps talking about, according to Isaiah 26:3. So join us as we do more in the next videos to follow up with Ezekiel 13. Thank you very much, and God bless you for listening. Stay tuned for more episodes in videos to help you with your journey from No More Sea